Today's global news has the feel of a dashboard flashing in every corner at once. Diplomacy is moving, but under threat. Oil markets are breathing easier, but only a little. Voters in Colombia appear to have delivered a sharp political turn, but not a clean mandate. Europe is sweating through dangerous heat. The American West is fighting fire. And at the World Cup, the teams that were supposed to be side stories are suddenly writing the plot. The common thread is fragility. Not collapse, exactly. Fragility. A ceasefire that needs verification, a shipping lane that needs to stay open, an election result that needs formal legitimacy, a market rally that needs proof, a summer heat pattern that is testing schools, power grids, and emergency services, and a sports tournament reminding everyone that models, odds, and reputations only get you so far. Let's start with the story most likely to move markets in the next 48 hours. The United States and Iran. Vice President J.D. Vance says talks with senior Iranian officials in Switzerland have created what he called a good foundation for a final deal to end the war. The framework sets up a 60-day negotiating period, with nuclear issues, inspections, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Lebanon front all in play. Axios and the Associated Press reported that Iran agreed to allow International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors back into the country, and that negotiators discussed mechanisms to keep the Strait of Hormuz open and to preserve a ceasefire involving Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. That is the fact pattern. The interpretation is more complicated. This is not a peace deal that markets can simply price and forget. It is a pause with a deadline. And the deadline matters because each side is trying to gain something different from the same 60 days. Washington wants nuclear limits, inspections, and a reduction in regional escalation risk. Tehran wants sanctions relief, oil revenue, and security guarantees. Regional players want the Strait of Hormuz open, because that waterway is one of the most important energy choke points in the world. The risk is that the framework is trying to do too much at once. It is trying to end a war, reopen or stabilize shipping, limit a nuclear program, contain Hezbollah, satisfy Congress, reassure Gulf partners, and calm oil markets. Any one of those would be difficult. Together, they make the agreement highly sensitive to headlines. President Trump's own rhetoric is part of that volatility. Reports from the talks describe Iranian negotiators as angered by Trump's public threats of renewed strikes. Vance said those threats did not derail the negotiations. But for investors, the point is not whether the talks survived one weekend. The point is whether implementation can survive the next provocation. Oil told that story clearly. Prices eased as signs of progress reduced the immediate geopolitical risk premium. But this was not a market saying the crisis is over. It was a market saying the worst-case scenario may be less likely today than it looked yesterday. That distinction matters. Relief is not the same as confidence. Now to Colombia, where politics may be shifting sharply to the right. Preliminary results from Colombia's presidential runoff show right-wing lawyer and political outsider Abelardo de la Espriella narrowly ahead of leftist Senator Iván Cepeda. The vote count points to a deeply polarized electorate, and the likely change in Colombia's security posture, its peace process politics, and its relationship with Washington. Earlier official and observer reports had already confirmed de la Espriella and Cepeda as the runoff contenders after the first round, underscoring how stark the ideological choice had become. Euronews.com. Here again, the fact is the vote. The interpretation is the mandate. A narrow win, if formalized, is not the same thing as broad national permission. Colombia has lived for decades with the intertwined politics of insurgency, peace negotiations, narcotics trafficking, rural inequality, and urban security. A leader promising tougher law and order policies may find support from voters tired of insecurity, but he may also inherit protests, institutional resistance, and pressure from communities that fear a rollback of peace commitments. For markets, Colombia's direction matters because political risk affects energy, mining, infrastructure, and sovereign debt. A more pro-Washington government could reassure some foreign investors. But if the election's legitimacy is contested, or if social unrest grows, that reassurance could fade quickly. In Europe, alliance politics added another layer of tension. The reported dispute between President Trump and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is less important as a personal clash than as a signal. Even leaders who share ideological ground with Trump appear to be drawing limits around military commitments in the Middle East. That is important because alliances are not only held together by treaties, they are held together by willingness. And on Iran, that willingness looks uneven. Ukraine, meanwhile, is pressing its own campaign against Russian-occupied Crimea. Strikes on fuel and delivery infrastructure are designed to make occupation more expensive and logistics more fragile. That is the military logic. The investor logic is that the war in Ukraine remains a background risk for European energy, defense spending, and political cohesion, even when it is not the top global headline. Now let's turn to the World Cup, because the tournament is delivering the same lesson as the markets. Expectations are useful, but reality is undefeated. Cape Verde, one of the smallest countries in the tournament and a World Cup debutante, is suddenly one of the stories of the group stage. After drawing Spain, Cape Verde held Uruguay to a 2-2 draw, with Kevin Pina scoring from a free kick, and the team refusing to disappear against a traditional power. Spain, after that frustrating opening draw, answered with a 4-0 win over Saudi Arabia, led by Lamine Yamal and Mikel Oyarzabal. ENCA.com. That changes the psychology of Group H. Spain looks steadier, Uruguay looks pressured, Cape Verde looks fearless, and Saudi Arabia is now facing a very narrow path. Egypt also made history. Mohamed Salah scored as Egypt came from behind to beat New Zealand 3-1 in Vancouver, earning Egypt's first World Cup victory. That is a sporting milestone, but also a national emotional moment. For a country with deep football culture and repeated World Cup frustration, the first win carries weight beyond the table. Iran's World Cup campaign is even more politically charged. On the field, Iran drew Belgium 0-0 and moved closer to a possible knockout round breakthrough. Off the field, disputes over travel restrictions, tournament conditions, and the display of pre-revolutionary lion and sun symbols have kept politics inside the stadium gates. The Associated Press reported that the off-field issues again dominated the conversation after the Belgium match. Japan delivered one of the cleanest statements of the tournament so far, beating Tunisia 4-0 in what was described as the 1,000th match in World Cup history. Japan is no longer just trying to advance, it is trying to define itself as a team with deeper ambitions. And Argentina? Argentina opened its title defense with a 3-0 win over Algeria, powered by Lionel Messi. Several reports described it as a Messi hat-trick, another reminder that even late in his career, he remains one of the tournament's emotional centers. Now to climate and public safety. France is facing a punishing heat wave. Météo France has warned that much of the country is entering a prolonged plateau of dangerous heat, and reports say hundreds of schools have been closed while many more have adjusted hours. Some areas are forecast to see temperatures around 40 to 42 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 104 to 108 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not just a weather story. It is an infrastructure story. Schools are not built for this everywhere. Rail systems are not built for this everywhere. Older housing stock is not built for this everywhere. Health systems are forced to plan for spikes in heat illness. Employers have to adjust outdoor work. Families have to make decisions about children, elderly relatives, and cooling costs. In the United States, the risk picture is more scattered, but still severe. A tornado in Illinois reportedly killed 2 people. Severe storms have damaged communities in the Midwest and threatened parts of the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. And in Utah, the iron fire forced the evacuation of Eureka as hot, dry, and windy conditions fed fire behavior. The Associated Press reported that the fire had burned 34 square miles and forced evacuations in and around Eureka. The broader takeaway is that extreme weather is increasingly a balance sheet issue. Insurers feel it, utilities feel it, municipal budgets feel it, agriculture feels it, tourism feels it, and households feel it through premiums, taxes, repairs, and disrupted work. Markets are watching all of this through 3 lenses: oil, inflation, and confidence. Oil is the first lens because the Strait of Hormuz is still the pressure point. If shipping remains open and inspections move forward, crude could give back more geopolitical premium. If the waterway is threatened again, or if fighting resumes in Lebanon, the risk premium can return fast. Energy prices feed transportation, chemicals, agriculture, and consumer expectations. Weather can feed food prices and insurance costs. Central banks know this. Investors know this. The question is whether these shocks remain contained or start to reinforce one another. Confidence is the third lens, and it is showing up in places like SpaceX. The company's post-IPO trading has become an early test of how much ambition public investors are willing to capitalize today. The pitch around orbital data centers is bold. But bold technology stories require either patience, proof, or both. When expectations get ahead of near-term evidence, volatility follows. The Federal Reserve is also entering a new communication era. Kevin Warsh took office as Fed chair in May. And recent reporting says his Fed may move away from the heavy forward guidance investors have grown used to. FederalReserve.gov. That matters because forward guidance has been one of the market's favorite stabilizers. If the Fed talks less explicitly about where policy is going, investors have to infer more from inflation data, labor data, and speeches. That can make rate meetings more volatile. It can also make markets more honest. Less handholding means more repricing when the data changes. The day also brought the death of Alan Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve Chair who led the central bank from 1987 to 2006. He died at 100, according to the Associated Press. His legacy remains contested. Long expansion and low inflation on one side, criticism of regulatory and monetary choices before the financial crisis on the other. APnews.com. That contrast is fitting on a day when the current Fed is debating how much guidance is too much. Greenspan was famous for opacity. The post-crisis Fed became famous for communication. Warsh may now be testing whether markets have become too dependent on being told what comes next. Beyond the macro headlines, institutions are under pressure in more localized ways. In Los Angeles, Superintendent Alberto Carvalho's resignation comes against the backdrop of an FBI investigation, putting one of the country's largest school districts under renewed scrutiny. In Washington, the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool has become a dispute over maintenance, vandalism allegations, and the care of national spaces. In Australia, police announced what they described as the country's largest cocaine seizure, with 2.7 metric tons found outside Western Sydney. The Associated Press reported authorities estimated the drug's street value at $816 million Australian dollars. APnews.com. In sports beyond the World Cup, Wyndham Clark won the U.S. Open at Shinnecock Hills after nearly losing a large lead. Serena Williams is set for a Grand Slam singles return at Wimbledon with a wild card, and North Carolina forced a decisive Game 3 in the Men's College World Series Finals. Serena's return is especially resonant because it would mark her first Grand Slam singles appearance since the 2022 U.S. Open, with a doubles wildcard alongside Venus Williams also adding to the moment. APnews.com. And in entertainment, Toy Story 5 showed the power of familiar franchises. The film opened with a reported $160 million domestically and $312 million worldwide, the biggest debut of the year, and a franchise best opening. That matters for media investors because the lesson is not simply nostalgia wins. The lesson is that trusted intellectual property still has global pricing power when execution, timing, and audience memory line up. In a fragmented entertainment market, a family franchise that can travel internationally remains one of Hollywood's most valuable assets. So where does this leave us? Here are the forward-looking scenarios to watch. The constructive scenario starts in Switzerland. U.S. and Iranian negotiators keep talking. Inspectors return. The Strait of Hormuz remains open. Hezbollah-related fighting stays contained. Oil prices continue to ease. Investors rotate from crisis hedging back toward risk assets. In that version, diplomacy does not solve everything, but it buys time. And in markets, time has value. The adverse scenario is also straightforward. A provocation at sea, a strike in Lebanon, a breakdown over nuclear inspections, or a political backlash in Washington or Tehran causes the 60-day process to lose credibility. Oil spikes. Inflation expectations firm. Equity futures wobble. Central banks become more cautious. In that version, the deal becomes not a bridge to peace, but a pause before the next escalation. For Colombia, the constructive scenario is a narrow result that becomes institutionally accepted, followed by a disciplined transition, and a security agenda that avoids reigniting social conflict. The adverse scenario is a contested outcome, street protests, and policy uncertainty that weighs on investment. For climate, the constructive scenario is competent emergency management, cooling centers, school adjustments, fire containment, and grid resilience. The adverse scenario is a chain reaction of heat illness, power stress, transport disruption, wildfire spread, and insurance losses. For the World Cup, the fun scenario is chaos with quality. Cape Verde advances. Egypt builds momentum. Japan keeps raising its ceiling. Spain and Uruguay fight through pressure. The adverse scenario, at least for tournament organizers, is that politics around Iran, security screening, and travel restrictions become as visible as the matches themselves. And for markets, the key question is whether investors are pricing a real reduction in risk or just a temporary absence of bad news. Those are not the same thing. The closing takeaway is this: Today was not defined by one crisis. It was defined by many systems being tested at once. Diplomacy is being tested by threats. Energy markets are being tested by a choke point. Democracies are being tested by narrow mandates. Cities and schools are being tested by heat. Fire crews are being tested by drought and wind. The Fed is testing how much less it can say. And the World Cup is testing every assumption about favorites and outsiders. For investors, the lesson is to separate facts from scenarios. The fact is that talks are happening. The scenario is that they produce a durable settlement. The fact is that oil has eased. The scenario is that Hormuz stays open. The fact is that Colombia appears to have shifted right. The scenario is that the new government can govern. The fact is that extreme weather is disrupting daily life. The scenario is that adaptation spending becomes a larger and more permanent part of public and private balance sheets. And the fact is that in politics, markets, climate, and sport, fragile pauses can become turning points.